Cool. All right. Looks like we've got the green light to go ahead and get started. Sorry for the wait, everybody, a little bit of technical difficulties that we had to sort out there. But I do want to go ahead and jump in because there's a lot to go over today. Just a quick heads up, though, for anyone in the audience, if you want to take notes, feel free to do that. But I am also happy to share the slides for this presentation with anyone who's interested. So don't feel like you have to write down everything that's on every slide. Just shoot me a message afterwards and I'll be happy to send you those. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and jump right into it here. A little bit of background. I've been working as a personal trainer and an online fitness coach for about 10 years now. And so during that time, I've had the privilege to work with a wide variety of different people from all different backgrounds and walks of life. And of course, they have a variety of different goals that they want to achieve when they come to me for coaching. But I have to say the majority of the time, what most people want to achieve really boils down to just two things. And that is that they want to feel better and they want to look better. And so the way we do that is actually pretty straightforward, and it's by having more muscle mass and less body fat. And so that's what I help my clients do. That's what I specialize in, and that's what I'm going to be talking about here today. And the good news is that nutrition is actually the most important factor for achieving both of these goals. And a whole food plant-based diet is a fantastic way to go about tackling them. So don't worry about anything that you may have heard. You can absolutely build muscle and get in great shape on a vegan diet. And I'm going to show you how to do that. So just a quick overview of some of the topics that we'll be covering. We're going to look at energy balance and what that is. We'll look at losing fat versus gaining muscle. We'll look at tracking your progress and different ways of doing that. We'll go deep on macronutrients and kind of explore each of those a little bit. Some specific tips for fat loss and a sample meal plan for fat loss as well. And then some tips for building muscle and a sample meal plan for that. However, before we begin, I just want to make a couple of quick disclaimers here. And the first one is that you don't have to do everything that I'm about to talk about if you just want to be healthy. So if you just want to make sure that you're eating a super healthy diet that's fueling your body with all of the nutrients that it needs and setting yourself up for a long and healthy life and minimizing your risk of chronic disease, well, then you should just be eating a whole food plant-based diet and getting plenty of physical activity, and that will put you on the right track to good health. And when we say a whole food plant-based diet, of course, that just means a diet where the majority of your food is coming from kind of minimally processed plant sources. So things like fruits and vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts and seeds, and things of that nature. However, if we want to make a really targeted change to our body composition, things like having more muscle mass or less body fat than we do currently, then taking a more kind of structured and strategic approach to our diet is very beneficial. And the good news is that we actually do have a lot of power here with dietary changes to make some notable changes in our appearance and our physique. And if you're looking for a good example that it is indeed possible to build muscle and get in shape on a plant-based diet, even without the best genetics, well, you don't have to look any further than myself. So I want to share this picture with you guys, which was taken many years ago now, back early on in my fitness journey. And as you can see, despite my impeccable taste in holiday-themed headwear, it's safe to say that I was a pretty skinny guy. However, if we fast forward about 10 years here, you can see that I have had some good success in gaining muscle as a lifetime natural athlete and as a lifetime plant-based eater. Now, it is very important to note, though, that there were several thousand hours of resistance training that also went into that transformation. And so that brings me to kind of my final disclaimer here, and that is that resistance training is also a key part of this process. And I think most people understand that, of course, if you want to get bigger and stronger muscles, doing resistance training, lifting weights is a really good idea. But it's also actually equally important to do resistance training if your goal is fat loss, because that's going to help to make sure that you're maintaining muscle mass very well during your fat loss diet. And when you're losing weight, that the weight is actually coming from body fat that you're losing and you're not losing muscle as part of that process. And so resistance training is kind of the missing piece of the puzzle here that's going to allow us to get the best results in conjunction with our dietary efforts to build muscle and burn fat. Now, resistance training is a huge topic, and so in the interest of time, I'm not going to talk about it further today, but just know that if this is something you're interested in tackling, resistance training is definitely something you should be doing on a regular basis. All right, so moving further forward here, I want to dive into some of our nutrition topics, and the first one is energy balance. And what is energy balance? Well, it's pretty straightforward. Energy balance is basically just the ratio of the calories that you have coming in through your diet from food and drink versus the calories that you burn through physical activity, and then also through your basal metabolic rate, which is basically just the energy that your body uses to keep things ticking along, keep the lights on, so to speak, while you're at rest. Now, energy balance is actually going to be the main driver, both for fat loss and muscle gain. And so it's very important that we understand how it works so we can use that in our efforts. And just to kind of define our terms here a little bit, a calorie is a unit that is commonly used to measure energy in the body and in food. And so when we're talking about calories, we're just talking about energy. And it's also important to note that the easiest way to make changes to our energy balance one way or the other is typically by making changes to our dietary intake, because that's going to have the biggest impact. We can also, of course, do exercise to burn more calories. However, I find people often tend to overestimate how many calories they're actually burning through exercise. And you've probably heard the expression before that you can't outtrain a bad diet. There is a lot of truth to that. And so for that reason, it's always a good idea to prioritize diet first and foremost. Now, to go a little bit deeper here with energy balance, there are kind of three main states that we can be in with our energy balance. And the first one is pretty straightforward, and that's maintenance intake. This is when your calorie intake is roughly equal to your calorie expenditure. And so this is when your weight is going to stay about the same. It's said that you're at maintenance. And this is basically what the body will try to do by default if you're at a healthy weight already. Now, next up, we have a caloric deficit. And this is when your caloric intake is actually less than your caloric expenditure. And so this is when weight loss and most fat loss is going to happen, because the body will then actually break down its own tissue in order to make up the difference between the calories that it needs and the lower number of calories that you're getting in through your diet. And then on the flip side, we have a caloric surplus, which is basically the opposite of a deficit. This is when calorie intake is greater than your caloric expenditure. And so this is when when weight gain and most muscle gain is going to occur, because the body is able to use those extra calories to synthesize new tissue like muscle mass or body fat, for example. So looking at losing fat versus gaining muscle, a common question that people have when they come to me for coaching is, can I lose fat and gain muscle at the same time? And of course, this is kind of the best of both worlds. It would be great if we could do that. That's what everybody wants to do. But unfortunately, I hate to be the bringer of bad news, but it usually isn't the best way to go about tackling things. And the reason for that is, as we just discussed, fat loss requires a caloric deficit in order to progress optimally. And muscle gain requires a caloric surplus in order to progress optimally. And a surplus and a deficit, of course, are opposites. So you can't be in both at the same time. And so for that reason, if you're trying to lose fat and gain muscle at the same time, by definition, you won't be doing both of them ideally. And probably you won't be doing either of them ideally, because what typically ends up happening in that situation is you're just eating around maintenance, and you can make some progress there, but oftentimes you end up spinning your wheels and not progressing as quickly as if you were to just pick one goal or the other and focus on it for a period of time. So now that we know that it does work best to focus either on fat loss or muscle gain at any given time, which one should we do first? Well, some kind of common sense recommendations here. Of course, if you're overweight, you have some excess body fat to lose, then it's a great idea to do a fat loss diet first. Now, on the other hand, if you're on the thinner side of things, like I was when I started my fitness journey, well, then doing a muscle gain diet first is a great idea. And if you're somewhere in between, you could potentially go either way, but my recommendation would be to do a muscle gain diet first, because that's typically going to be easier to do. Being in a calorie surplus versus a deficit means you have more energy coming in, more calories to work with. And so that will allow you to kind of get familiar with the process of structured dieting in an environment that's a little bit more forgiving. Now, with either one of these goals that we choose, though, it's also important to keep in mind that we're not just going to keep dieting for that goal forever. It's a really good idea to just have a set time frame in mind for your diet before you start, so that you don't keep going past the point of diminishing returns where the diet becomes unsustainable and you get too burnt out. So for a fat loss diet, it's a really good idea to limit it to about 12 weeks or less in duration. And this is going to be a good chunk of time where you can absolutely make some notable progress, lose some body fat, but you're not going to stick around too long to the point where you start running into some nasty issues like having a lot of hunger and cravings. There can be some hormonal changes that occur. And basically, if you keep trying to diet for too long, it's more likely that you're going to end up rebounding and gaining back the weight that you lost. And of course, we don't want that to happen. And so for that reason, it's actually a really good idea to take a break after your fat loss diet. And this is where we have this period of maintenance. This can be 8 to 12 weeks long. And so it's about 2/3 to the same length of the diet phase itself. This is something that most people don't do, but it's a really good idea if we want our fat loss to be sustainable, because it gives you a break from that physical and psychological stress of being in a calorie deficit and restricting calories. And it also allows your body to get used to being at that new lower weight that you've gotten down to. So your body has kind of a set point of the weight that it sort of thinks you should be at. And if you've been at the same weight for a long time and then you start losing weight, you're getting further and further away from that set point. And the more you do that, the body will kind of start to resist a little bit. And it's more likely that, again, you will start feeling super hungry, having a lot of cravings, more likely to fall off the wagon and end up gaining weight back up towards your set point. However, if we take this period of time at maintenance and allow the body to kind of reset that set point, it will come back down to your new lower weight. And then you can start, it's almost like hitting a checkpoint. You can continue with another fat loss diet after that, and you'll be able to make progress much more easily than if you just tried to diet straight through the whole time. And then for muscle gain purposes, we can see the time frame recommendation is a little bit longer here, and that's for two reasons. One, gaining muscle is a slower, more gradual process, so we need to allow time for that to occur. But also, being in a caloric surplus is not nearly as fatiguing as being in a deficit, so it's a lot less likely that we'll get burnt out from it. And so you can diet for muscle gain for 8 to 16 weeks or even longer if things are going well. And then afterwards, we don't need to have as much time at maintenance, but it's still a good idea to take at least a 4-week maintenance break after your muscle gain diet. And again, that will allow your set point to kind of renorm to that new higher weight that you've gotten up to. And then if you were to start a fat loss diet afterwards, it's less likely that you're just going to lose that muscle mass that you just gained at the tail end of your gaining phase. So to summarize here, basically, if we take these periods of time at maintenance intake in between our fat loss and muscle gain diets, that will allow us to string together multiple phases of dieting for fat loss and muscle gain over time in a way that's really sustainable. And we can kind of repeat that process in an iterative fashion as long as we need to in order to get to our end goal without getting too burnt out. Alrighty, so moving along to tracking our progress here, there are a few ways that we can do this, but the first one that I want to look at with you guys is actually keeping track of your diet. And there are a number of benefits to doing this. Even if you just like jot down what you're eating in a notebook or something simple like that, it tends to make you more conscious of your food choices. You pay more attention to what you're eating. And so for that reason, then you will often make better food choices. You eat a little bit healthier. And it also gives you some really important baseline data where you can actually see what your diet looks like currently. And then you can start making adjustments in a systematic fashion to move in the direction that you want to go for either fat loss or muscle gain. Now, the next level kind of diet tracking approach that we can take is a little bit more advanced, and that's actually to track our calorie and macronutrient intake. And this is super powerful because it gives us a really high level of kind of precision and control over the diet, but it is a little bit more effortful and it's not strictly required in order to build muscle or lose fat. So if you don't want to track calories and macros, you don't have to, but if you're open to trying it, I do recommend that you give it a shot because it is super useful. And the good news is nowadays we have access to some really powerful tools that we can use to make that process a lot easier. So if you do want to get started with tracking calories and macros, I recommend using one of the free apps that are out there. There are a lot of them, but I'll recommend either MyFitnessPal or Chronometer are great ones to use. Basically, the way these apps work is they have a really comprehensive database of millions of food inside the app. So whatever you can think of to eat, very likely it will be in there. And so all you have to do then is plug in what you're eating and how much, and then the app will do all the work for you of basically crunching the numbers to tell you how many calories you're getting in per day and also how many grams of your macronutrients you're getting in. And so with that data, then you can start to make some really informed decisions about how to manipulate your diet to achieve the goals that you have. Now, if you're new to diet tracking, I recommend starting with MyFitnessPal because it's a little bit quicker and easier to use. And then if you have some experience with tracking calories and macros, Chronometer is a great option because it provides a little bit more detailed information. With either one of these apps, though, again, a great place to start is just by tracking your current diet, establish that baseline, because it's very likely that if your weight is stable currently, then however much you're eating at the moment is going to be your maintenance intake. And that gives you a good starting point then to start increasing or reducing calories to target muscle gain or fat loss. And also by starting with your current diet, it just makes things a little bit easier and more sustainable. You can kind of make changes in an iterative fashion over time rather than trying to overhaul everything that you're eating overnight. Alrighty, so next up, I want to look more closely at macronutrients. I kind of mentioned them a moment ago, but macronutrients, of course, are where we're going to get our calories in the food that we're eating. And macronutrients come in a few different varieties. You've probably heard of these. So carbohydrates, of course, are going to be about 4 calories per gram that we consume. Protein is also 4 calories per gram. And then fat is going to be around 9 calories per gram. So it's worth noting that fat does have more than double the caloric density of carbohydrate and protein. And that doesn't mean that fat is bad or that we shouldn't eat it, but it does mean that a little bit goes a long way when it comes to dietary fat. Typically, we'll be eating a little bit less than we might with carbohydrate and protein. And then just in the interest of being complete, I do have alcohol listed here as well because it provides 7 calories per gram. However, unfortunately, I'm not going to recommend alcohol as a good source of your calories if you're trying to lose fat or build muscle, although it can be a great one to cut out if you want to lose fat because that will help shave off some extra calories that you might be getting in. So just to summarize here, our daily energy intake is measured in calories. Calories come from macronutrients, and macronutrients are found in the food that we eat. And where are they found in food? Well, I'm so glad you asked. These are some of our whole food plant-based sources of macronutrients. So first up, we have our carbohydrates, and carbohydrates are really abundant. They're easy to get in if you're eating a whole food plant-based diet. And they can be found in things like whole grains and legumes, as well as starchy vegetables like potatoes and sweet potatoes, and in fruit and other vegetables as well. Next up, we have our whole food plant-based protein sources. And these are going to be, of course, the superstars here are going to be our legumes. So things like beans, split peas, chickpeas, and lentils, as well as traditional kind of minimally processed soy products. So things like tofu, tempeh, maybe some edamame and like unsweetened soy milk are great sources of protein as well. And then protein can also be found in smaller amounts in foods like nuts and seeds, whole grains, and even in leafy greens and other vegetables. And then finally, our whole food plant-based fat sources here. So these are going to be things like nuts and seeds, avocados, traditional soy products, like the ones I just mentioned. So again, our tofu, tempeh, edamame, and so on are going to be great healthy sources of dietary fat. So moving further ahead, we'll look more closely at each of these macronutrients. First up is protein. And when we are interested in building muscle or losing fat, it's a good idea to kind of allocate our protein intake first, because protein is going to be kind of a building block. It's fundamental for building muscle tissue. Muscle is actually made out of protein. And it's also equally important to make sure that we're getting plenty of protein in if our goal is to lose body fat, because that's going to help to preserve muscle mass so we don't lose too much muscle while we are losing body fat on our diet. Now, it's important to note that the ideal protein intake for building muscle and losing fat is significantly higher than the optimal intake just required for good health and well-being. And so just for health purposes, we can see the recommendation here is about 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of healthy body weight per day. So if you weigh 70 kilos, that would be about 56 grams of protein per day. And that's just not a lot of protein. It's very easy to get that in on a whole food plant-based diet. So we don't usually have to worry about that for health purposes. But you can see the recommended range here for muscle gain and fat loss outcomes is going to be significantly higher at 1.5 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of healthy body weight per day. So again, if you weigh about 70 kilos, that would be anywhere from about 100 to 150 grams of protein per day. So it's worth noting we can use supplements like plant-based protein powder in order to hit that higher protein target more easily, but these are absolutely not required. Protein powder is more of a convenience than a necessity. So if you don't want to use it, that's totally cool. Just make sure that you are getting in plenty of protein from the whole food sources that I just mentioned. So next up, we have our dietary fats here. And as I was saying earlier, fat is a concentrated source of energy, but it's also an essential nutrient. So we do want to make sure that we have enough fat coming in through our diet for good health. And it is worth noting that dietary fat is more easily stored as body fat than protein and carbohydrates are. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it, because dietary fat is already coming in the form of fat. So it's easy for the body to store that as fat. And so for that reason, it is a good idea to limit our fat intake a little bit. Of course, if we're trying to lose fat, we don't want to be storing a lot of excess fat, but also for muscle gain purposes, we don't want to be gaining an excessive amount of fat on our muscle gain diet. And so for that reason, it's usually a good idea to keep fat intake between the range of about 0.7 and 1.1 grams per kilogram of healthy body weight per day. And so if you were, again, you weigh 70 kilos, that's going to be about 50 to 77 grams of fat per day. And then finally, we have our carbohydrates here. And of course, carbohydrate is going to be a really easily accessible source of energy for the body, and it is the body's preferred form of fuel for physical activity and also for the brain. And so typically this will make up the majority of our daily calories, but it's worth noting carbohydrate is actually not an essential nutrient. We don't have to have a certain amount in order to survive. And so what we'll do then is just scale our intake depending on our goal. Of course, for muscle gain, the intake will be a lot higher because our calorie intake will be higher. And then for fat loss, intake will be lower to match that lower calorie intake. So typically, once our protein and fat are allocated, then the remainder of calories we have left for the day will come from carbohydrates. Usually that's around 50% or more, but depends on your situation. All right, so that's a little bit about macronutrients. I want to shift gears now and talk a little bit about tracking your body weight and why that can be a good idea. And as we just talked about, of course, if we're trying to gain weight and build muscle or lose weight and lose body fat, of course, our weight is going to be changing in either one of those situations. And so if we keep track of our body weight, then of course that helps us to get a reading on what's going on, if we're moving in the right direction, and also if the rate of weight loss or weight gain that we're seeing is appropriate or if we need to adjust things. So tracking body weight does provide some really valuable data. However, I understand some people don't like to do it. Maybe you don't want to hop on the scale too often, and that's totally cool. If so, some alternative methods that you can use to help gauge your progress are things like doing circumference measurements with a tape measure, paying attention to how well your clothes are fitting, doing progress photos, which is kind of a cool visual way to keep track of your progress, and then also just paying attention to things like how you look and feel, because at the end of the day, if you look great and you feel great, it doesn't matter too much what the scale says. But with that being said, the scale is a powerful tool that we can use to help gauge our progress. And so if you don't mind doing it, I recommend giving it a try. And here's the best way to track your body weight. So basically, we want to weigh in at the same time of day, every day, so that it's consistent. And first thing in the morning is usually the best way to do that. So after you wake up and go to the bathroom, before you have anything to eat or drink or get dressed, you can hop on the scale. That's typically going to be your lightest weight of the day, but it's also the most consistent. However, even if you do the same conditions every time, it is normal for your weight to fluctuate a little bit from day to day. And so for that reason, it can be a good idea to weigh in a few times across a week. Doesn't have to be every day, but at least 3 times a week is a good idea. And this will give us some data points then where we can calculate your average weight for each week. And then you do that over the course of several weeks. And once you've been doing that for a few weeks, you can start to compare each week's average to the next and so on. And that'll give you a really good idea of what's going on. Of course, if your weekly weight averages are increasing, then it's very likely that you're in a calorie surplus, which is great for building muscle. If your weekly averages are decreasing, well, then it's very likely that you are at a deficit, which is great for fat loss. And if your weekly averages are staying about the same, well, then it's very likely however much you're eating at the moment is your maintenance intake. So looking a little bit more closely at weight loss and weight gain, we've got some recommended ranges here of how fast we should be doing these. And it is worth noting fat loss typically can go significantly faster than muscle gain. And so we can see the recommended range here is going to be anywhere from 0.5% to 1% of your total body weight per week that you would lose for fat loss. So for example, if you weigh 70 kilos, you would be shooting to lose anywhere from about 350 grams up to 700 grams per week. And then on the flip side, for muscle gain, we can see the recommendation is basically half as fast. So looking to gain anywhere from 0.25% up to 0.5% of your total body weight per week. And so again, if you weigh 70 kilos, that would be anywhere from about 175 grams up to 350 grams per week. And now you may be wondering, how do changes in our calorie intake actually affect body weight? And so we can see some kind of general guidelines here. This isn't 100% exact, but it'll give you a good idea to go on. So we can see that for every 500 calories per day that we eat below our maintenance intake, we can expect to see about 500 grams of weight loss from that over the course of a week. And then on the other hand, if we were to eat 500 calories per day above our maintenance intake, we would expect to see then about 500 grams of weight gained per week. And what does 500 calories look like? Well, it can look like many things, but this is just a quick and easy example here. You could have a couple of slices of whole grain bread with some natural peanut butter and banana. That would be a really easy way to get in those 500 calories, or take them out if you wanted to lose fat. Now, of course, a common question that people have when they see these recommendations is, can I lose weight or gain weight faster than that? People are often in a hurry when it comes to achieving their fitness goals. And of course, you can indeed go faster than that, but it's usually not a good idea to do that. And the reason for that is, particularly for fat loss, it can get pretty nasty, because if we're in a calorie deficit and we're restricting calories so much that we're losing more than 1% of body weight per week, that means the risk of muscle loss is going to be higher. Of course, we don't want to lose muscle during that process. It also means that you'll be more hungry and have less energy because the calories will be so low. And this makes the diet less enjoyable, less sustainable, and it's more likely then that you'll fall off the wagon and end up eating more. And if we combine that with our final point here, which is metabolic adaptation, this is kind of the kicker. And what that means is basically the body can detect when we're in a calorie deficit and we're losing weight over time. And it doesn't want you to lose too much weight because it doesn't want you to starve to death. And so if you're in a really steep calorie deficit, you're losing a lot of weight every week, more than 1% of body weight per week, the body is going to start to get real efficient using the calories that you do have coming in. And the way it does that is by actually slowing down your metabolic rate. So you just burn fewer calories all the time. And that's good from a survival standpoint, so you don't starve to death. But it's bad if we're trying to lose weight in a sustainable way, because then what ends up happening is your metabolism slows down to here. Then you at some point probably break the diet because it's unsustainable. Your calorie intake ends up here. And of course, you have a calorie surplus. You end up regaining the weight that you lost, and you end up back in that cycle of yo-yo dieting that we want to avoid. So for that reason, it's a really good idea to keep fat loss to 1% of body weight per week or less. Yes, it takes a little bit longer, but it's 100% worth it, because you'll get to keep your results for the long term. And then for muscle gain, it's a little bit more straightforward, but basically, if you're gaining more than 0.5% of your body weight per week, it's very likely that that extra weight that you're gaining is just going to be in the form of body fat. And of course, we don't want to gain a ton of extra fat on our muscle gain phase if the goal is ultimately to have a leaner physique, because that's just going to create more work for us in the future to kind of clean up that extra fat that we've gained. All right, so I've given you guys hopefully some good information here, just sort of fundamental concepts to get a sense of the landscape when it comes to dieting for fat loss and muscle gain. But I want to get a little bit more practical now and talk about some tips that we can use day to day when we're setting up our diets for success with either one of these goals. So a concept that we can use to our advantage when it comes to dieting for either fat loss or muscle gain is energy density. And I kind of alluded to this earlier, but basically energy density just refers to the number of calories in a particular weight of food. And this can vary a lot depending on what type of food we're eating. And so we can use that to our advantage, of course, eating foods that are higher energy density to get into that calorie surplus for muscle gain, and lower energy density for fat loss to stay in a deficit. It's also worth mentioning, though, that whole plant foods do tend to have lower energy density, but higher micronutrient density than processed foods and animal products. And this is great from a health standpoint, because it means we'll be getting in the best nutritional bang for our buck, where we're getting in lots of micronutrients like vitamins, minerals, as well as fiber, antioxidants, phytochemicals, things that are really beneficial for our health. We'll be getting in a lot of those relative to the calories that we're consuming. And it also means that dieting for fat loss can be easier on a whole food plant-based diet, because again, you get to eat a greater volume of food to help keep hunger at bay, keep you feeling full while still keeping the calories lower. On the flip side, it does mean that dieting for muscle gain can be more challenging if you don't have a big appetite, because you do have to eat a lot of food in some cases, but we have some strategies we can use to help make that process easier as well. So just looking first, though, at some tips for fat loss. First one seems like maybe it could be a little bit of a no-brainer, but that's basically just to cut out the low-hanging fruit here. These are foods that are very high in calories, not very nutrient dense, and they also don't satiate you very much. And so these are going to be things like oil, which of course is just pure fat, and fat is very calorie dense, as I mentioned earlier, as well as sugary beverages and soft drinks, things of that nature, and alcohol. All of these can add a lot of calories really easily, and they don't fill you up or keep hunger at bay hardly at all. And so if we cut those out, you can often shave off a few hundred extra calories per day to help get into a deficit without feeling like you're going too hungry. Then following along from that, another tip is to eat foods that are higher in fiber. So these are going to be things like whole grains, legumes, as well as fruits and other vegetables. And this is great for fat loss because fiber is thermogenic, which means that it actually requires energy to break down and digest in the body. And that's great if you're trying to burn more calories to stay in a calorie deficit. But fiber also adds a lot of bulk to the diet. And so that, again, is just going to help keep you feeling full and satiated. It is worth noting, though, that the body will kind of adapt to whatever fiber intake you give it within reason. And so if you've been eating very low fiber for a while, and then you suddenly start eating a lot of high fiber foods, you may start noticing digestive issues like bloating and being gassy and stuff like that. And if that happens, you don't want to stop eating high fiber foods altogether because they are super healthy and beneficial. But it's just a good idea to increase your intake of them gradually over a period of several weeks. And typically, if you do that, then your body and your gut microbiome will actually adjust and you'll be able to digest them more easily. And then another interesting point here that we can use to our advantage is actually to eat more intact whole foods rather than blended foods. So examples of this would be having like whole nuts instead of nut butter, brown rice versus rice noodles, and then whole fruits and vegetables instead of juices or smoothies. And the reason for this is, again, eating intact whole foods is going to be more filling and satiating, but also the calorie absorption from those intact foods is a little bit less, because if we're eating them intact, some of the calories will actually pass through without getting digested and absorbed. And this is good because it goes to feed our good gut bacteria and, again, to help to cultivate a healthy gut microbiome, versus if we blended everything up in the blender first, then all of those calories are getting digested and absorbed, makes it a little bit harder to stay in a calorie deficit. And then just a few more tips here for fat loss. This is kind of a cool one, which is to practice mindful eating. And of course, it's hard to do this nowadays because we're all so connected with our devices, whether it's phone or TV, computer, whatever it may be. It's super easy to just zone out watching YouTube or Netflix while you're eating. But if you actually make a point of not doing that, really focusing on your food while you're eating it, chewing your food thoroughly and trying to really enjoy it and kind of savor that process of eating, you'll find that the meals then are going to be a little bit more satisfying. And it can also help to extend the duration of your meals to about 20 minutes or so, because it can actually take 20 minutes for your body to register that you've eaten. And so sometimes if you're just wolfing down your food while you're binge watching Netflix, it's really easy to overeat if you are eating in less than that 20 minutes, because the body doesn't have a chance to register and kind of down-regulate the hunger signals. Now, another tip here is just to stay hydrated. Of course, it's a good idea to do that in general if we're keeping active, but if we have cold water in particular, that can actually help to boost metabolism a little bit, so we burn more calories doing that. Drinking water before and during meals can also help you to feel a little bit more full if you're reducing your portion sizes because you're trying to stay in that calorie deficit. Having a bit more water with meals can help fill you up. And a recommendation here is about 1 liter of water per 20 kilograms of body weight per day. But of course, if you're doing a lot of physical activity, breaking a sweat and so on, it's fine to have a bit more than that. And then a final tip here for fat loss: you can use caffeinated beverages like coffee and green or black tea in moderation if you want to. Caffeine does have a couple benefits for fat loss, which is that it suppresses hunger. And again, it slightly boosts your metabolism. But of course, it can also interfere with sleep. And so if you do choose to have it, I recommend keeping it just to the first half of the day for that reason. But of course, it's also totally fine to not use it at all. Okay, so tying all of those tips together, what might a sample day of eating look like to help us achieve our goal of fat loss? Well, here is an example. So for breakfast, this is actually one of my favorite breakfasts that I have almost every day. Breakfast of Champions, which is just some oat porridge with soy milk and berries. And so oats are great to have in this case because they're very filling and satiating relative to their calorie content. They're going to provide some complex carbohydrates and a little bit of protein as well. And then if you have a good unsweetened natural soy milk with that, you'll be getting in some protein and healthy fats there. And the berries, of course, will make it taste great, add a lot of micronutrient density, but without adding too many excess calories. Then as a snack, basically any type of low calorie content, high water, high fiber fruits and vegetables are great. So this is kind of a fun one, which would be some baked kale chips. These are super tasty, but you could also have any other type of vegetables that you like cucumbers or celery, carrots, capsicum, and even ones that don't start with the letter C, like peaches or apples, oranges, pears, things like that would be a great snack just to give you something to munch on in between meals without adding too many extra calories. Then for lunch, this is another really delicious one, which is a tofu and vegetable stir fry. Of course, the tofu is going to provide plenty of protein to help us maintain muscle during our fat loss diet. And the veggies will provide lots of volume and lots of nutrient density to help us feel full. And depending on your calorie allotment, you could also have some carbohydrate with this meal, which would be fantastic. but it's also fine to have something like this just on its own. However, I do want to point out, if we're dieting for fat loss, we don't want to use a lot of oil to stir fry this. A much better idea would be just to use something like water or vegetable stock, because that will shave off those empty calories from the oil. It might not be quite as crispy that way, but from a fat loss standpoint, that's very advantageous to do. And then for our post-workout meal, this is one time of the day where we might have a protein shake just for convenience, because getting in some protein and carbs in an easily digestible form after your workout is great for recovery, because your body is going to be sensitized to take up those nutrients and shuttle them into the muscles that you've just trained. So we could have our shake there, but you can see we are still having the intact fruit, a couple of whole bananas there, rather than blending it up into a smoothie, because that's going to be a little bit more filling, help keep us keep hunger at bay for longer. And then for dinner here, this is a really beautiful one, which is just kind of a nice, thick, hearty vegetable soup. So we've got some lentils in there for protein and complex carbs, as well as some potatoes, which are a great source of carbohydrate, and they're very satiating as well. And then you can throw in any other kind of greens and veggies that you want to for variety and nutrient density. And it's worth noting that for whatever reason, soup just tends to produce more satiety even than other similar meals of the, similar composition, number of calories are about the same. People tend to report feeling fuller after they eat soup. And so if you like having soup, that's a great one to use on your fat loss diet. All right, and then just shifting gears here a little bit to look at some tips for muscle gain. Basically, what we want to do here is just flip the script from what we did for fat loss. And so that means we're going to eat more high energy density foods to help get those calories in to get into a surplus and gain weight without overfilling ourselves with too much volume. So these are going to be things like whole grains, nuts and seeds, dried fruit, and so on. And a good tip to use here is actually to do the opposite of what we did for fat loss. We're going to purposefully use those ground and blended foods, because this makes them easier to consume and easier to digest and absorb. So this means, getting in like your nuts and seed butters. Whole grain bread and pasta are also fine. Smoothies are a great option. And that brings me to the next tip, which is actually to get some of your calories in liquid form if you can. It's usually easier to drink calories than it is to eat them. And so if you make a really big smoothie like the one you can see on the side here, with lots of fruit like bananas, maybe even some dates, some peanut butter or nut butter in there, maybe some soy milk and protein powder if you want to go that route, really easy way to get in a ton of calories that way. And then a final tip here for muscle gain is to front load calories. This just means getting plenty of food in early in the day so that you don't fall too far behind with your calorie intake and end up having to play catch up at the end of the day. Because again, when you're eating a high volume of food, you don't want to overstuff yourself to the point where you can't maintain the diet. And so then to put all of those tips together into a muscle building meal plan, as we can see, the breakfast, still having our oat porridge there, but we're getting in a lot more calorie density because we've got some dried fruit and some nuts and seeds on top. So that's going to help with front loading calories, getting more of those calories in early in the day without adding too much extra volume to the meal. And then for a snack, this is just a super quick and easy one. A couple slices of whole grain bread with natural peanut butter. Takes 0 time to prepare and an easy way to get in several hundred extra calories there. And then at lunch, this is actually one of my favorite meals that I have almost every day myself, which is kind of a Mexican style burrito bowl. So we've got rice and beans in there for protein and complex carbs, as well as some corn and other veggies. And we even have some avocado in there for some healthy fats and greater calorie density as well. And then for our post-workout meal, you can see we still want to get in our protein and carbs in an easy digesting form to help with recovery. But in this case, it's fine to throw everything into the Vitamix, make one of those nice big smoothies, and you can really easily down that after your workout and get that recovery process started straight away. And then for dinner, again, this is another one of my favorites, which is some whole grain pasta with a lentil bolognese sauce. And this is great because pasta oftentimes is a little bit easier to eat than intact whole grains like rice, for example, so you can get in calories easier that way. The lentils, of course, are going to be a great source of protein. And then by having a sauce like this, you can throw in lots of different veggies and greens in there and still get those nutrient density, but without the high volume that you would have because they cook down a little bit, versus if you were having the veggies on the side in a salad, for example, you might end up feeling overly full. All righty, so I know that was a lot of information to get through. Thank you guys so much for sticking with me if you've made it thus far. We're nearly at the end, but I just want to summarize some of the key points that we've gone over. So first of all, nutrition, of course, is going to be the most important factor, both for building muscle and losing body fat. and we want to be in a caloric surplus where we're gaining weight in order to build muscle, or in a deficit where we're losing weight in order to lose body fat. Now, tracking calorie and macronutrient intake and body weight both provide some really valuable information, so I recommend doing those if you don't mind. However, they're not required. You can absolutely make progress without doing that. And then just tips to help with our fat loss diet, just to recap, of course, cutting out those low-hanging fruit foods like oils, soft drinks, and alcohol, including more foods that are higher in fiber and water content, and that's going to help keep you feeling full and satiated, as well as more intact whole foods. And then, of course, we want to practice our mindful eating, stay hydrated, and if you want to, you can use caffeine in moderation, but of course, it's not required. And then tips to help with muscle gain dieting, including more of those calorie-dense and blended whole foods to help us stay in our caloric surplus. Drinking calories is often an easier way to get them in, and also front-loading calories, basically just being proactive, getting plenty of food in early in the day so we don't fall behind. Alrighty, so that is it. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this presentation. I really hope you enjoyed it and found this information helpful and can put it into use in your own fat loss or muscle gain journey. I would love to do some Q&A right now, but unfortunately, I think we just don't have the time because we did get a little bit of a delayed start there. And so if you do have any questions, though, please feel free to contact me. My contact information is on the slide here. And if you want to build muscle or lose fat on a plant-based diet, I want to help you do it. So please don't hesitate to reach out. I offer a free 30-minute consultation where we can just get on the phone, talk through your situation, and come up with a plan of attack for you. No obligation to sign up for coaching or anything like that. So feel free to reach out and contact me if you want to. Again, thank you so much for coming to my presentation today. Really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the expo as well.
Thanks. Everyone, give a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you, Carl.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you. My pleasure.